Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our seminar this morning on construction and health and safety issues at Level 3. Following the government's announcement on Monday that we will be moving into Alert Level 3 come Tuesday next week, that means that construction activity can resume from that time, but it also, of course, raises a number of issues and questions as to how we can operate safely and within the law and guidelines. So I'm delighted to welcome you to this session. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sarah Townsend. I'm one of the partners at Duncan Cotterill. I specialise in health and safety in particular, and also employment law. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce this morning our two construction law experts who will be running this session. Jonathan Forsey, a special counsel in our litigation team, and Julia Flattery, a senior associate in our commercial team. So without further ado, I will hand over to Jonathan to commence the presentation, and we'll run through, and then I'll pop up at the end and moderate some questions which you may well have come the end of the session. So welcome again, and Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for those of you who were able to sign up at such short notice. Do apologise for that, but this is a very fast-moving topic, and we thought that it was best to have a discussion before these things kick off, rather than a luxurious seminar about 2 weeks into the process. Hopefully you'll be able to gain some benefit from that. We circulated a note on the changes which have the website links to a lot of the material that I'll be talking about, and you should all have that. If you don't, then please let us know. This is being recorded, so it will be put up on our YouTube channel for those of you who weren't able to come in live, and I know that's quite a few people with childcare issues and other things. So this information will be made available on our YouTube channel for you to watch later if you can't find anything good on Netflix. And there is the capacity to ask questions. We'll cover those off at the end of the session. Please do so. Anything that's over sort of 8 paragraphs long will probably require a bit of a deep dive. So please try and think of others when you're posing them, but we'll try and get to as many questions as we can. Apologies in advance for any incidental noises at this end with my daughter telling me to keep the noise down. I'll try and keep those to a minimum. And just to note that because we are talking about, at this stage, fairly hypothetical scenarios covering a large number of workplaces and subject to a large number of contractual conditions and relationships between parties, this is not the provision of legal advice. This is about the facilitation of a discussion with those of you in the sector about the restrictions that are in place to enable work to be carried on in Level 3. So if you do have specific issues or queries, please contact us. You'll get the contact details either in the materials you've already got or at the slide at the end for any specific advice. So that's really the housekeeping from me. Let's just launch into the exciting topic. So what we're going to cover today is the background very briefly as to how we got here. I'm not going to go through the history of the coronavirus, but just gives us a bit of an insight into how the government has been looking at this process and what they're trying to achieve. The Level 4 transition to Level 3, because construction, unlike a lot of other businesses, has had some ability to carry on emergency related works during even the Level 4 lockdown, so there is some industry experience. The overlap with existing health and safety obligations, these don't go away, they're not suspended, and they do continue to operate and are very important on construction sites. The guidelines that the government has promulgated through MBIE on its website, the practical implications of those, and then my colleague Julia, who's joined through the mechanism of my mobile phone, which will mean that I'll have to be doing some exciting facial contortions to put her phone next to the speaker, we'll be talking about the cost implications and doing a bit of crystal ball gazing about how it might work in terms of the contract, because of course a lot of these additional requirements will have consequences in terms of additional time and cost. We don't know what they are yet, but they're not likely to be cheap. But doing something's better than nothing. So if we could just pop on into the background. So as we all know, the transition to level 3 is going to be at 11:59 p.m. on Monday, April the 27th. There is a transitional period to allow some businesses to go back in and make ready. But the new work or the new world will resume from that point. But it won't be back to work in the normal sense. The old habits, which are deeply ingrained in construction culture, will have to change significantly. And a great deal of planning, communication and understanding will need to occur at all levels, and communication really does have to be effective and is the key on this. And my 2 cents is that it's going to require possibly a greater level of cooperation and understanding than we have been typically used to. I'm not saying that people don't get on site, but boy, are they going to have to get on to make this work. So at level 3, people who are able to work from home must do so. So if you have contract works which are able to be carried on remotely, that must occur. And work that has to be done on site or cannot be done from home needs to be done with health and safety and physical distancing measures in place for staff and building occupants. And I break down the guidelines that we get a little bit later on, because they MB have broken it down in terms of the vertical and horizontal sector, the residential sector, and then also provided some tools and other information about how that's all going to work. So under level 3, there must be appropriate health and safety measures in place. We'll talk a bit more about physical distancing. That's one of the key ones, but there are others. And Construction Health and Safety New Zealand, CHASNZ, in conjunction with the Joint Government Industry Construction Sector Accord, have developed the detailed construction health and safety standards and protocols for the residential, civil and vertical sectors. And you'll appreciate they'll have done this work, and it's quite a lot of work, and it's a lot of material to go through in a really short space of time. And I think it's actually been quite useful. It won't be perfect, but to have that level of guideline available in advance is certainly very useful. And we'll get on to what some of those templates and guidelines are as we do a bit more of a deep dive. So we are in a period of transition from level 4 to level 3. So under level 4, building and construction work could be completed if it met the government's definition of essential service. I've just set that out there because everyone will be aware of the projects that have been able to continue, but just to really make the point that construction work has been going on in a very limited way throughout level 4, and other aspects of construction work around design and so forth have been continuing remotely. So under level 3 now, from the 27th, on-site work is permitted for the building and construction sector, provided there is a COVID-19 control plan in place. Now that is an actual thing that will need to be drafted and implemented and circulated and understood for each site, with appropriate health and safety and physical distancing measures for staff and building occupants. Work is permitted in occupied buildings or homes, so that's in the residential environment, or works being carried out in occupied spaces with additional safety measures and physical distancing protocols in place. Businesses are allowed to travel to neighbouring regions for work. Currently that is identified as being an adjacent region, so neighbouring means what it says. You can go from Canterbury to Otago, you can't go from Canterbury to Taranaki. We probably can't anyway, but they are trying to restrict the regional, the potential intra-regional transmission of any COVID infection. So that's the rationale for that restriction, but it does mean that Canterbury construction companies can operate in Otago, for example. And I know that there's some who will be affected by that. They're going to have to figure out how it works, but it is not just restricted to the immediate vicinity and does allow a slightly broader range of work to be carried out. And building and construction businesses are able to buy products and materials from building and construction retailers and suppliers under level 3, and those outlets will have health and safety and physical distancing measures in place. A lot of them already do, with click and collect arrangements or pre-arrangement and then delivery, or leaving pallets of materials outside to be collected. They're already been working through those systems, and they do seem to be reasonably polished. So that is a transition point from level 4 to level 3. And so councils are also involved in this, of course, in terms of the regulatory framework and their requirement to conduct inspections and certify work. And the clarification from MB is that councils are continue to perform their statutory and regulatory functions with staff working from home where they can. So where work cannot be carried out from home, council workers may work on site, providing they also adhere to the health and safety and physical distancing measures. They're not allowed to have interaction with the public until level 2. So working from home would involve the council doing desktop assessments and processing the non-on-site parts of consent applications and the like. Building and construction site inspections can take place with appropriate safety measures in place, and avoiding close interaction where possible. So if normally you would hug your council inspector, you will no longer be able to do so. I'm sorry, that is not an option until level 2 or possibly level 1. Councils may consider accepting other forms of evidence to be satisfied on reasonable grounds that the work has been carried out in accordance with the building consent. MB give the example that a homeowner or a builder may provide photographs of completed work. That is potentially very useful development, and communication with councils is essential to determine what may be acceptable in advance. And by that I mean, don't assume that they will accept photographs as proof of completion of work for consent purposes. I would have a discussion with them in advance to make sure that they will accept that kind of information, and carefully coordinate with them so that if you are providing stuff for them to approve when they're working from home, that it's done in a way that enables everyone to get on with it as easily as possible. And that will come down to how large data files are and all that kind of thing, because people are working remotely and don't necessarily have access to the full suite of support structures that they do at work. But the signal from MB is that councils are to crack on with it and to facilitate the process of work being carried out under level 3. So hopefully we'll be getting some more guidance from them. Councils being councils, it's going to be a question of contacting whoever is relevant for the work that you're doing, and not assuming that one council's approach will be adopted by the others. That'll be down to staff and departments and teams, but hopefully will be made available on council websites, and certainly in response to direct inquiry. So just on the next slide. This is my favourite slide of the whole presentation, and it demonstrates a workplace that will not be acceptable, just to clarify that, under level 3. And I thought it was important to show you what you're not allowed to do. Actually, there's a few other significant health and safety violations in there as well, for good measure, but yeah, it's definitely a don't do it like this. But this section I'm talking about overlap with existing health and safety. So to operate under alert level 3, businesses must have a COVID-19 control plan in place to protect staff and others on site. This is separate from and in addition to health and safety plans already in place, and all contracts, all construction contracts and the acts require health and safety plans to be in place for construction sites. This is an additional requirement, which is an overlay for level 3 operation. One key control measure is physical distancing, which means keeping 1 metre between workers on construction sites. And where tradespeople are working in other people's homes or workplaces, they must stay 2 metres away from people at the location. That clarification and the point of difference in there was clarified very recently by WorkSafe and has been included in MB and its guidelines. So there is a bit of a difference where you're interacting with people on a work site, which is 1 metre, and where you're interacting with other people in their homes or workplaces, it's 2 metres. appreciate that that might sometimes cause a few problems, but the 2 metre separation is consistent with the guidelines that we've all been living with in terms of when we go out for our, exercising our poodles, in terms of the social distancing requirements when you're outside your bubble. The 1 metre, I think, is to recognise the impracticability of 2 metres in many occasions on a work site. Quite how 1 metre translates to the WHO recommendations, I don't know, but it is, I think, recognising the reality of enabling work to continue. Control plan must also show how to meet hygiene requirements such as hand washing and equipment cleaning, and the measures in place to allow for contact tracing. So all those things are really important. The personal hygiene component, PPE if required, and also a strict control on people who have been on site, so that if the worst comes to the worst and you do have somebody on site who is sick and tests positive, then that will enable rapid contact tracing, which is one of the vital control measures that the government has settled on for enabling level 3 to operate. And I guess it's important to emphasize at this point that what we're talking about is a framework to enable something to happen that might not otherwise happen. So it's really important that there is buy-in from the sector. In terms of how important is this, I think it's pretty important, and you don't want to be the organisation or the site that lets the side down when somebody comes along with their phone and takes a photograph of 30 people queuing, touching hands outside a portaloo, or 60 people crammed into a portacom trying to use one microwave to reheat their pies. You don't want to be the organisation that has that photograph put on the front page of Stuff, and then community people up in arms about why are they allowed to do it and we aren't, etc. So that's, I'm not being facetious, I think that really is the guts of it. So the guidelines themselves, there's 2 construction workers there pointing at guidelines, which are clearly printed out and put very large on their site. That's good. So there are standards documents for vertical and horizontal protocols, residential construction protocols, and then there's a section of tools and resources, including a template COVID-19 plan. Use of these is encouraged, and they are likely to be viewed as best practice. There is a lot of resource there, so I would encourage those of you who haven't to really look at it, because you don't have to start from scratch, which is really good. Some organisations have gone further, and they have provided other templates. I know that master builders have done that, so they've produced templates consistent with this requirement. So there is a lot of information, just talking now about the vertical and horizontal protocols. The key is that the considerations start before the workers are on site. It's not just a question of starting when people are on site. It covers how they got there, where they're coming from, and potentially issues such as whether shared accommodation is required if they're moving to work at other sites, and certainly shared transport, and all that kind of stuff is dealt with in the protocol. And on-site communication and record keeping to enable contract tracing is critical. Okay, hopefully it's not too blurry, but that's just an excerpt from the vertical and horizontal guidelines, and shows how they've divided it down into steps to take before arriving on site, which includes inductions, and you can do inductions remotely, and the importance of workers being educated on understanding the requirements around personal health, so that if people are unwell, they don't attend site. And that's really critical. A lot of people are under stress at the moment for very understandable reasons, but if people are unwell, it's really important that they not attend site, because the consequences in terms of infection are just too great. And employers must also get from their workers how they travel to and from work. If there is shared transport, that is not the preferred option, and if it does have to be shared, it's recommended that teams are split up so to create sort of mini bubbles inside vehicles, and there's also stuff that we'll get onto around the cleaning of vehicles on a very regular basis, and also to ensure that workers understand when additional PPE may be required in accordance with the plan, to make sure that that is available, and also to train people in using it properly, because there's no point giving somebody a mask if they use it to wipe their forehead. And there are Ministry of Health PPE guides and WorkSafe guidelines that they refer to there. And that applies primarily to face masks and gloves. I know that a lot of people, even where it's not mandatory, are facing situations where employees do not feel comfortable unless they are wearing masks, and that's just something to work through with people and discuss with them how they feel safe on site and what is needed for them to work. Then site entry, the importance of having a daily register, and also controlling deliveries to site to make sure that they're only to one confined area, and that you don't have people coming into the work site and wandering around. And then signage, reminding workers of the COVID-19 physical distancing and hygiene protocols. That signage is one of the tools that's in the tools section. And then site operations, that's primarily aimed around physical distancing, site transportation, and making sure that work is carried out in accordance with the guidelines. The importance of toolbox talks and reminding workers about what they have to do, and of course they will be slightly more spaced out toolbox talks than we might be used to, with people standing more than a metre apart. They're really important to get buy-in to the COVID-19 plans, which of course do have to be discussed and with the workers to ensure that they understand them and that they can provide feedback which can then be considered and incorporated in the plan. It's really important that there's buy-in to this process rather than just being simply imposed. Smokers must follow the physical distancing and hygiene protocol, and there must be the response plan itself must be available on site, so you have to have a copy of it available somewhere on site. And then leaving the site, there's the sign and register, and when returning home, workers need to undertake hygiene measures, site cleaning, and waste and disposable PPE removal from site and securely disposed of in accordance with the cleaning guide. Again, you don't want to have masks and gloves and the like left lying around site. It's not really what it's there for. And then there are management protocols, which is around communicating the site expectations to workers and contractors, and a response plan for what you're going to do if something happens, and keep all the contact details and stay in contact with all workers, including those who may be in isolation or working remotely. Even where you have got a workforce where you wouldn't necessarily have everyone's contact details, that must happen. So there's there might be a bit of a change there culturally in terms of agency staff and the like, but just making sure that people's personal contact information is kept up to date. So that's probably that slide. That shows you the level of detail that we're looking at. The physical distancing protocol, what is it? Sometimes known as social distancing. I think physical distancing is actually a better term myself. It's not really about being antisocial, it's about being physically removed. So to be accurate, I think it is physical distancing. And so they talk about 1 metre separation between people at work as the minimum, and greater separation where it's reasonably practicable to do so. There will be occasions, of course, when it isn't practicable to do so because of, among other things, the requirements of other health and safety obligations around working at height or carrying heavy loads, which will require proximity, hopefully no closer than a metre, but will require people to be working together to be safe, because the other health and safety requirements are not suspended. Cleaning protocols, again, sorry for the tiny writing, but I thought it was important to accurately reflect what the protocols are rather than paraphrase them, and these are on the MB website anyway. And so that's all around regular cleaning, the use of suitable cleaning products, using disposable materials, disposable gloves, and then the disinfection of the cleaning materials themselves, site cleaning, wiping down door handles, railings and personal workstation areas, and cleaning all high touch areas, and also transport where that's used. So I won't go through everything, but that's just to give you an idea again of the kind of detail, and that will have impacts which you'll already be thinking about in terms of the time required to wind the site down at the end of the day, and who's going to be doing the cleaning work and making sure that it's done to an appropriate standard. With these things, a lot of people are going to have to self-clean because of where they are on site and their areas of responsibility. So yep, even details down to cleaning tips using mops and buckets. So it's good that MB have got that under control. Cleaning surfaces, toilets and showers, and the types of materials to use. And also probably to reflect a plea that some of you will have seen in the media for people not to put antibacterial wipes down the toilet because they don't get processed and they clog everything up. So there you go. I can give you plumbing advice as well as legal advice on this presentation. Cleaning tools and equipment and cleaning vehicles, again, very important, especially with work vehicles and sharing teams, because this is essentially an extension of the workspace, and just to make sure that people are being as safe as possible and as consistent with the guidelines as possible. Cleaning PPE. Some things are single use only, and they are usually not to be cleaned and reused. But it's basically following instructions, and luckily COVID doesn't seem to require any special disinfection or any treatment or burning or disposal of protective equipment. But it does require cleaning. Soap does a good job on it, which is really encouraging, but soap does need to be applied. So there's the information there about cleaning PPE and specialist clean. And then there are residential construction protocols for residential work, which they've separated out, and they're separated into 4 sections. Before arriving on site, site entry, site operations including deliveries and visitors, and leaving site. And I've just included those there. They're very similar to the vertical and horizontal ones. They're just broken down slightly differently. So before arriving on site, we've got all of the information there around identifying situations where workers might be required to work closer than 2 meters, but always more than 1 meter. Because don't forget that for the residential context, it's more likely to be the 2 meter requirement rather than 1. A resourcing plan to maintain a work bubble on site, and communication channels with workers, reinduction of the COVID-19 control plan protocols before coming to site, and toolbox talks to see how it's going and reiterate compliance with the COVID plan. Site entry, again, setting up clear entry and exit points, and that's all around controlling access, having wash stations and hand sanitizer available, and ensuring that people sign in and sign out. You'll be getting a bit of a theme here, and largely it is common sense, but it's all got to be reflected in the plan. But not only that, it has to be communicated to the people that it's relevant for. Site operations, how we work on site, trying to eliminate face-to-face meetings, eliminate the number of direct interactions with people, minimizing, if you can, the use of fixed tools. So have key tasks such as using a drop saw done by one person rather than everybody doing it, the same piece of equipment. Workers to bring their own drink bottles and lunch to work, no leaving site to pick up lunch during the day. And I would say that's something which is a relevant consideration, and we'll go on to it with the practical measures about how you deal with catering for workers on site where they do not have the options available to them to go to the supermarket and get a pie during their break. And I think often we will be seeing people making catering available I'm not talking about anything lavish. Certainly you wouldn't want a buffet, but making individual lunch boxes available to people on site to minimise their travel and interaction with others. Site visitors, no non-essential visitors to site, so you can't have people popping in to seeing how it's going. The signing people in and out and ensuring that they maintain their physical distancing. And then a sign-out process leaving site, so contractors, visitors, and those making deliveries to sign out before they leave the site. And the importance around that is that it be accurate. So people do have to get into the habit of doing it. I know it's a pain, but it actually has to be done to keep a log of people coming in and out of site, so that if tracing is required, it can be carried out easily. And then a wash hands and use hand sanitizer before leaving the site. Practical issues. You'll see there the workers are delegating their practical issues to the person with the least impressive facial hair, which is the time-honoured tradition. So really, what are we looking at in terms of what you're going to have to be doing? I would say top of the list is ensuring mechanisms for effective communication, maintaining registers and ensuring compliance with the plan. Having the plan is actually reasonably straightforward in that they've pre-generated a lot of the information required, but the trick is communicating it with people, getting the buy-in to the plan, and making sure that it is effectively communicated. Induction processes are important for that, and also signage on site. If you have a workforce that does not have English as a first language, then of course the inductions and information and signage should be in a language that is understood by the staff who are on site. Considering staggering breaks and providing catering to minimise congestion at site facilities. So having people taking their smokos at different places on site, preferably undercover. The provision of PPE, the provision of hand washing stations, managing deliveries and inspections. That they are anyway, but this is just a question of being more rigorous around it. Ensuring sick staff don't attend work. Ensuring compliance with existing health and safety obligations, because as I've said on several occasions, these aren't suspended. And just an awareness of public scrutiny and concerns of homeowners where relevant. So these are anxious times, people are upset, people are nervous about their futures, people are nervous about the present, people are pissed off with their children, and they will be doing things like being especially, particular in their scrutiny of activities around the home. So for construction workers interacting with homeowners, that is, I would say, really relevant. The homeowners will be relieved that the work's going on. I have no doubt they might be worried about how they're going to pay for it, but they will be relieved that the work's going on, but they won't want to be exposed to anything which they perceive makes them unsafe. So that is a real driver there. And on bigger sites, there will be public scrutiny because it's commercial activity, which we haven't seen for a couple of weeks. So will, of course, draw attention to a greater degree. And there are other sectors of the economy who are not allowed to work at all. So they'll be they'll be looking at construction to see how it's managed and how successful it can be, because it might support their own cases for being able to progress a bit quicker than would otherwise happen. So that's the end of the practical issues bit, which is the end sort of my part of the presentation until we come to questions. My colleague Julia is going to talk about extension of time and contract issues and costs, because of course none of this takes place in a vacuum. So hopefully this will work.
Hi, so good morning everybody. So I'm going to now run through some of the relevant contractual provisions and implications of complying with the new site requirements. And for the purposes of this section, just to note, I'm basing my comments on the NZS 3910. There are similar provisions obviously in the other NZS documents, but as always, you'll need to check the special conditions and exact contractual terms of the relevant contracts for each project in each case. And in particular, it's worth noting that the standard provisions I'm going to refer to are amongst those that are more commonly amended in special conditions. So firstly, extensions of time, and this is perhaps the most clear cut of the two. So it would seem logical that the contractor should be able to claim an extension of time under 10.3.1.f. The wording of that is on the slide, but that states that the engineer shall grant an extension of time for completion of the contract works or any separable portion if the contractor is fairly entitled to an extension by reason of any circumstances not reasonably foreseeable by an experienced contractor at the time of tendering and not due to the fault of the contractor. So compliance with all the new requirements that Jonathan has just spoken about clearly wasn't foreseeable at the time of tendering for projects already underway and will clearly cause a delay to project. And so therefore the contractor should be entitled to claim an extension of time. It's important to note that the contractor, as always with extension of time provisions, will need to comply with the notice requirements and provide the information required under the contract. And in some instances, the special conditions do go on for several pages as to what needs to be provided, and they're quite strict. So it's important that those procedures are followed. A bit of crystal ball gazing. So for future projects which haven't yet been tendered or contract entered into, depending on the wording, then the need to comply with these requirements are now foreseeable, which would therefore mean the contractor would not be able to claim an extension of time under 10.3.1.f. And we're therefore anticipating, some of the discussions I've been having with both principals and contractors who are going into tender at the moment, is an anticipation that contractors will therefore make allowance in their tender programmes to allow for the additional time it's going to take. So moving on now to costs, and this is going to be the less clear cut of the two issues as to the ability for the contractor to claim costs that clearly will incur in implementing and complying with these new requirements. So there are a number of provisions that I think will need to be considered in contracts, and it's potentially going to be a large area for dispute going forward. So firstly, there are probably already cost discussions underway in relation to costs as a result of suspension of site works over the last 4 weeks under either 6.7.1, so the engineer instructed suspension, or 6.7.5, the mutually agreed suspension provisions. And if those discussions are ongoing, it would seem sensible to raise these new additional costs as part of those ongoing discussions, as this may result in an agreed process and method for recovery of these costs going forward. If the works haven't been suspended under either 6.7.1 or 6.7.5, which we are aware is the case on some projects, but instead the engineer has instructed a variation under 5.11.10, which is the change of law clause, then again it would seem sensible to raise these new additional costs as part of the ongoing discussions that are no doubt happening around that variation. There is potentially an argument that the imposition of these new requirements in itself falls within the remit of 5.11.10. And just a reminder, that clause states that if after the date of closing of tenders, the making of any statute, regulation or bylaw, or the imposition by government or by a local authority of any royalty, fee or toll increases or decreases the cost to the contractor of performing the contract, such increase or decrease not otherwise being provided for in the contract, the effect shall be treated as a variation. And as these new requirements have basically been imposed by government in order for site works to recommence under level 3 and possibly down through level 2, then there's an argument that the contractor should be able to claim a variation under 5.11.10 simply for complying with these ongoing protocols. And then finally, just to look at potentials for it to be able to be claimed as a variation under 9.2. So this is on the basis that if the engineer or the site works have been suspended, then presumably the engineer will be instructing the recommencement of the site works, and therefore arguably the variation provisions in 9.2 become relevant. This is on the basis that in order for the contractor to be able to recommence works, it's got to now comply with these new requirements. And therefore, it's arguable the contractor could claim a variation under 9.2.2 or 9.2.3. And those are the provisions that allow the contractor to claim a variation where the engineer itself hasn't instructed a variation, but where the contractor believes a variation should have been issued. And I think just to finish, and as Jonathan stated at the beginning, I think due to the disruption that COVID-19 and the lockdown has already caused and will continue to cause to projects, even though we can now get back to work, the key to avoiding disputes, which is only going to exacerbate the issue and delays further, is going to be good communication between the parties and endeavouring to reach a mutually acceptable position without having to resort to a dispute, which will only cause further delay and further cost to be incurred. And everyone just wants to get on with projects and get them completed as soon and as efficiently as possible. So that's our view of the contractual provisions at the moment. Obviously, it's untested and will come out over the next couple of weeks as to where parties land. And I think I'm now going to hand over to Sarah, who's going to run the question and answer element of this presentation. So thank you for your attention so far.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for bearing with us as well. It's having to come up with some new and creative ways of delivering these sorts of seminars to you, where we have unfortunately weren't able to see Julia Flattery this morning, but she managed to connect through the telephone. So thank you to Julia and Jonathan for your extremely helpful presentation. So for the next 10 minutes or so, 10-15 minutes or so, there's an opportunity for anybody who would like to ask a question to ask questions. There is an ability, there should be Q&A, an ability to ask questions in writing, and there are a couple of questions before I kick off. One of the questions I've been asked, or we've been asked, around health and safety, and Jonathan mentioned a couple of times around the issue that current health and safety obligations remain in place, unchanged, and the requirement to operate safely remains. Sometimes there can be a tension between those safe operating procedures and the new COVID-19 protocols, for example, for physical distancing and to remain wherever possible a metre apart. And so which trumps the other, for example, lifting heavy materials or holding ladders where you may need to be closer than 1 metre to a fellow worker. So in those circumstances, what our view is that you should be doing is you should be considering whether the work can be carried out in accordance with the COVID-19 protocols safely. So have a think about whether you can do things a different way, which don't involve such physical proximity. But if they cannot be done safely another way, then I think, provided that you are minimising as far as you can the time spent in close contact with other workers, it is important to continue to operate safely. You need to ensure that you're not causing workers or putting workers at risk of physical harm in and of itself just through the physical distancing. So that's one interesting aspect, that not all the guidance that we're being provided is always consistent with other guidance that we're being provided. So issues will arise. I'll turn to a question from Andrew, which is about looking to potentially downsize staff levels in the construction business, and how and this is an employment-related question, which is handy because I can answer it with my employment law hat on. But whether there have been any restrictions from a New Zealand employment law perspective to mitigate any employees going to employers on personal grievances, which would in turn hurt the business. So to paraphrase the question, I suppose, are there any protections for employers against personal grievances in the current situation where restructuring or redundancies may need to occur? Andrew, the very short answer to that is no, there are no additional protections in place for employers. In the same way as health and safety remains in place unchanged, employment law remains in place unchanged. So any employees who feel that they've been made redundant unfairly or disadvantaged in any way unfairly will have an ability to raise a personal grievance, and it is the employer's role to be able to demonstrate that it's acted justifiably by having a fair reason for what it did and going through a fair process. But while it may be more easy to show there was a fair reason for needing to make redundancies, for example, significant downturn in business, there will still be an obligation to go through a full and fair consultation with all staff who are affected in the same way as pre-COVID-19. If the business is claiming the wage subsidy, there are also additional restrictions on the timing of when redundancies can be made, and there is likely to be some serious difficulties in making any redundancies during that 12-week wage subsidy period. Hopefully that answers your question, Andrew. Second questions or observation from Norm, which I will hand over to Jonathan. Level 3 restrictions seem to rule out. He says some of this. I assume, Norm, by that you mean some work. What 1 metre is a strict rule. Looking at, as I said, in terms of that, maybe a comment in terms of the reference to can you carry out work if you can't do it safely with physical distancing? And yet, I guess the question is going to be, it depends a little bit on, from a health and safety perspective, on what the work is. But Jonathan, you may have further insight into that.
Yeah, there will be conflict between the 1 metre requirement and other health and safety requirements on sites. They will, as Sarah said, have to be worked through to see whether you can find other ways of doing things to enable you to work safely and adhere to the guidelines. The 1 metre is a strict rule, but then it's also a strict rule that you have to have people working safely at height. There might even be some aspects of jobs that are not able to be done at this time under the level 3 restrictions if they require a repeated exposure inside a 1 metre radius. But there are often ways of providing workarounds depending on the type of work that's being carried out. And the examples that they made in the residential guidelines around designating tasks to particular people so that they do all of it for everyone, rather than having other people coming and interacting with another worker or a piece of equipment on a regular basis, that may be feasible, but it's just a question of people working through it and seeing how it works. WorkSafe may be in a position to provide more clarification. I know that they are working actively with MB and actively updating the guidelines. So the things that we've published are live documents. So keep coming back to check them. This is a fairly unprecedented situation. So they'll also be looking at overseas experience in Australia and in the UK, where construction has carried on throughout the level 4 equivalent. And I know that early on there were discussions around electronic monitoring of people on site and impermeable barriers and that kind of thing, and geotracing and the like. And I don't think any of that's going to be implemented in New Zealand. But there are things that other workforces in other jurisdictions have done to change the way in which they are working. But you're right, the 1 metre is a strict rule in the level 3 guidelines, and will require a lot in the way of workarounds to see whether things can continue, and hopefully they can. But that will be difficult, but it will require communication and discussion, potentially different or different equipment or different methods of applying, different design, possibly. Who knows?
Thank you, Jonathan. And you mentioned in your presentation quite rightly a number of times the importance of ensuring that the COVID-19 control plan is effectively communicated to everybody who is working on site. One of the other aspects of that WorkSafe has made clear it expects to see is organisations consulting and engaging with their workers to help put that plan in place and continually improve it over time. So it's a living document, and often those carrying out the work will have valuable input or comment or observations as to what can be done safely, what steps may be able to be taken to make the workplace safer. So that communication and engagement, not only with workers but with other PCBUs as well on site, is going to be key to the successful operation of works under Alert Level 3. Not sure we've got any other specific questions pop up, so do take the opportunity if you do have a question to type it in while we've got the last couple of minutes. If something occurs to you after this session, then we do have all of our contact details up there on the slide. Please do feel free to contact us at any time. We are working, albeit from home, completely normally, so are available to respond to any issues or questions that you may have about this or any other issue that's affecting your business during this time. So on that note, I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Jonathan and to thank Julia for their very helpful and informative presentation. Thank you also for joining us this morning. And if there are any other topics that you want to hear from us about, please do let us know. But thank you very much for joining us today. That concludes today's presentation.